Welcome to the OT Potential Podcast. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that this podcast may qualify as continuing education for you. You are probably listening to this podcast on a free podcast platform, but to gain CEU credit, you will need to be a member of the OT Potential Club, our OT continuing education platform. After listening, you can log into the club to take a 5-question quiz, and we will generate a certificate for your time today. Okay, here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode and live webinar for the OT Potential Podcast. This week, we are talking about AI and treatment planning. I'm your host for this talk, Alan Linick, and I am very excited to discuss this topic because I personally have so many opinions and questions and thoughts and confusion about AI and all of its many possible uses. And to help get through all of that, we've got two wonderful guests joining us for our discussion today. First off, Cody Lee. Cody Lee, PT, DPT, is an orthopedic physical therapist in Southeast Alabama who pairs evidence-informed care with AI tools to sharpen clinical decisions and stay current with research. As co-chair of the Alabama APTA membership committee, he explores data-driven systems and value-based approaches to improve clinic operations and patient outcomes. Cody, how you doing?
Doing great. Happy to be here.
Great. How is the weather treating you? You mentioned it was like 80 degrees where you're at.
Yeah, it's okay right now. It could be hotter. I think we'll get there in a few weeks.
It could and will be hotter, you're saying?
Yes.
Great. Well, fortunately, we're all inside for the moment, and joining us from inside her place is Sarah Lyon, OTRL, the CEO of OT Potential, and she is on a mission to bridge the gap between research and real occupational therapy practice. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
You staying chill where you're at?
I'm staying chill. I'm a little, I want to say heated up about this topic too. It is definitely just one of the quickest developing topics that you can kind of imagine. It's so much to wrap your mind around. It feels like we're learning as we go, and I'm so thankful for spaces like this and communities like the club where we can be talking about it because the implications on our practice are huge. Like we have to keep up. I feel like we don't really have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, AI is for at least a year now has been at the top of so many discussions and is being kind of like wildly, I meant to say widely, but I'm going to lean into it. Wildly incorporated into so many different fields, and sometimes at like with no like real regard for what its impact is or like how it's best utilized. It's just like the new thing, so people are jumping on it. And I think that I'm not going to say reckless use, but that sort of like quick adoption has made it a really divisive topic in a lot of different industries. So I'm really excited to dive deep and see how we can discuss AI more specifically as it relates to OT. And in recent episodes of our podcast here at OT Potential, we've been discussing value-based care a lot. And in order to provide higher value, I think it's important, and I'm sure you two will agree, that OTs and everyone in the medical field utilize all available tools to the best of their utilization, to the best of their use. So AI is, as the newest toy, kind of the big talking point right now in a lot of different industries, as we mentioned. So in order to make this topic manageable, because again, there's like a million different things we could talk about in terms of how AI is built and how it's used and its potential for use with patients or on the back end of running OT practices. We're just going to kind of focus in on a single aspect of AI and OT, which is treatment planning. So I guess my first question for you, Cody, is in terms of use cases for AI and OT, where does treatment planning kind of fall into the hierarchy of like good and bad use cases or high potential use cases for OT?
Yeah, I would say it's a good use case. Definitely a lot of potential there for use with it. I know I've found a lot of value using it in my daily practice as a PT. I think the biggest thing is just using it kind of correctly. If you do it right, it can be very helpful. If you don't know exactly what you're doing or are a little confused by it, it can make things more difficult. So I think there are definitely ways to use it correctly.
Yeah. And Sarah, are you seeing, I mean, in terms of like from the research side, are you seeing an implementation or a drive towards using AI on that front of occupational therapy as well?
Yeah, I think that using AI for treatment planning is a strong use case because treatment planning so often is you're trying to like take in the available evidence, which I talk about this graph all the time, but we have this exponential graph of the amount of evidence that's available to us. It is truly impossible for one person to take in all the available evidence and know it all. Like, we truly need tools like AI to help us comb through everything that is available. So when we're treatment planning, tools like AI will allow us to just quickly take in what's out there related to a specific diagnosis and maybe the conditions of that patient, and help us filter it down. And treatment planning is also so great because treatment planning so often is like an initial brainstorming where I know for me, you walk into the room and you want to have some ideas of what you do, but 50% of the time those ideas get discarded anyway. So it's really is a starting point before you go in and you do that co-creation with the patient. But you also don't want to walk in with no ideas and a blank slate. So I really think that like a brainstorming partner is one of the strongest use cases for AI. It's not a finished product. It's something that we're going to take some initial information and then co-create with our patients. So we need it, and I think it really plays to its strengths.
Yeah, I want to circle back really quickly. I don't want to step on something we're going to talk about in a few minutes, which is structuring and sort of formatting our prompts to get the best possible outcomes when we do utilize AI. But Cody, you mentioned, yeah, if you use it right, which I think is like that's the answer for like any tool, right? Like, will the stethoscope help? Yeah, if you apply it to the chest and lung, you know what I mean? Like, so I think a lot of times when we are thinking about like, okay, my initial thought of treatment planning in AI is like, you plug in a prompt and then whatever thing you're using, whether it's, some version of ChatGPT or, any given AI product, like you're plugging in some kind of prompt and then it's spitting out just whatever. Like, I guess the question is, if we're talking about using it correctly, the first question I would have for you is like, what sorts of results should we be trying to get out of these systems in terms of planning for treatment?
Yeah, I should probably expand on the use it correctly, right? Yeah, so I think one way I've really found it to be helpful is I like to use Claude specifically, just an LLM public that's out there, similar to ChatGPT. But one of the really cool things that it developed, I think, first was projects feature. And so within that, you could essentially create a project for, say, a specific patient population. So let's just use the example to say, you're seeing someone who's experienced the CVA and they've got multiple deficits, and there's a lot that could be addressed there. And there's obviously a lot of research related to CVA, OT, PT, all the things that go along with that. And so where you could use Claude, and when I say correctly, it's you want to give it specific like context knowledge. So rather than just entering in the chat box, I'm treating a patient with X diagnosis, give me some thoughts on it. you would give specific like research papers, articles, blog posts, anything that's like high quality evidence that you could pull from, put that into a project related to that population, and then you could essentially have a conversation with that. And that's what I've found to be helpful. And then you could brainstorm a little bit there, like to Sarah's point, where you could think about what deficits are there, what does the research say, what's the best evidence I could use to treat this specific deficit, and come up with a plan. So I think it's, knowing the capacity that the tool has, the feature, so using a project, giving it specific context information so that it's more tailored to that specific patient or population that you're working with.
And then I'm assuming with something like Claude and doing these specific projects that then, if you're working on a project and then you go away from it and you come back, Claude still has kept all of its previous, anything you've uploaded or asked or worked on it, you can kind of pick up and iterate on that as you go.
Yeah, so within a project, it has a certain amount of knowledge it can hold. It's the capacity, so that's like 0 to 100%. I think Claude is like 200,000 tokens, which I can't remember how many pages that works out to, but it's quite a bit. You can put a lot of articles in there. But yeah, you can go away from it, and so it's going to have all that knowledge to pull from when you come back to. Now, it doesn't go across the chat. So if I have one chat going and I kind of exceed my limit and I've been having a long conversation, you might have to create a new chat. It's not going to pull from the previous, but all the knowledge and files that are in the project itself, it'll still pull from.
Oh, that's cool. What drew you to Claude, or I guess AI in general, in terms of treatment planning? What was there, like a aha, or like this is the moment that I'm going to turn to this tool or utilize this specific feature?
Yeah, there definitely was. So I was probably a lot like everyone, kind of getting used to it and just using it as a replacement for like Google as a search bar almost. And then I can remember I had a ACLR patient that I was going to be seeing for the first time, a younger gentleman who was a high level athlete, wanted to return to level 1 sports, soccer specifically. And so I hadn't encountered that specific patient in my clinical rotations as a student. I hadn't had that as a PT yet. So I was pretty nervous because I really wanted to provide kind of the best care I could. So I initially just kind of dove into the research manually, went and found all the articles I could, tried to consume all of them, in a weekend, read all the blog posts on it, listen to all the podcasts. And there's just so much information out there. It's just really hard to get it all down. And then that's when I kind of like discovered Claude and discovered the projects feature. And I was like, oh, okay, I could use this to kind of synthesize the research I'm going through. I can read this and then upload it, go back to it, ask it questions. And so what I did for that one specifically was I ended up kind of creating 3 different projects so I could go across the timeline for that specific person. So I had like an early phase ACLR rehab, mid phase, and late phase. And so I would find research for each of those phases. So try to keep the level of evidence as high as possible, a few clinical commentaries in there. But then essentially I could go back and have a conversation with it, talk about how the patient is doing. Obviously not using any PHI because they're public LLMs, so no patient data, just de-identified kind of like subjective of like having pain in this area or felt good after, the last session, things along those lines. And then the objective information as well. So, what is his quad strength looking like and what was his range of motion and different things along those lines to be able to track along with what the evidence says. So that was really helpful for those specific aspects of it. And that's kind of when I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot you can do here. And I just kind of went headfirst into it from there.
Yeah, can you walk us through a few of these like various tools? And you mentioned that you primarily use Claude. Are there other LLMs that are better suited to potentially different aspects of treatment planning?
Yeah, I do primarily use Claude for that specifically. Just that's just the one I've kind of stuck with. I've kind of gotten used to it the most, especially for the projects feature. I really like it. But then there are obviously like ChatGPT that probably everyone's heard of. There's Gemini. There's Grok. I think that one's by Twitter or X. Perplexity, Notebook LM by Google, which it's a little different. So there are a lot out there. Primarily, whenever I'm, looking at things from a treatment perspective, I'm using Claude personally, and then I'll use ChatGPT to just brainstorm kind of like daily things, but that may not be directly tied to patient specific or treatment or like PT related things. I like to use Gemini personally for their deep research function. So if you're ever interested in a topic, I think all of them probably have it now, but I like theirs the best for it. You could essentially create your own research plan. You can give it different constraints for, what you're wanting to research, specific topics, specific evidence to look at. It'll give you an entire treatment or research plan, and you can modify it and then run it. And it's normally like a 20 to 30 page report that it'll give you. And that searches across websites, articles, everything. So you kind of have to be specific on what you're looking for there. Notebook LM, I really like, again, for the research aspect. I think for that one, you can just dump in like tons of resources, tons of articles. So for the ACLR one specifically, a lot of those articles I put into Notebook LM, and then I would go back and you can create your own podcast with it. So that's a really neat feature to essentially create a podcast from whatever you want to listen to. It doesn't have to be OT or PT related. It could be anything. You can just throw the resources in there and create your own personalized podcast. I like to consume information by audio, so that one's been really helpful for me personally.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners right now can empathize with that feeling. And Sarah, I know as far as the research side goes, you were talking about right before we hit go on our webinar for today and started streaming. In our little pre-chat, you were talking about open evidence a little bit.
Yes, I love open evidence. It's the one that I use the most. What I love about it is that it cites where its suggestions come from. So you get like the 10 journal articles at the bottom, they're cited. You can go and see where the suggestions are from. I think it pulls from like JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, and then any open access articles. So it's really research focused. And I encourage everyone to do this. I like pulled up in all the different options. I got one prompt related to treatment planning and I just dropped it into all of them and really quickly got a sense of, which ones do I like? To me, like ChatGPT, Gemini, felt the same, and then open evidence felt really different. So I was like, if I were to have two, I would go with open evidence and then like a ChatGPT or Gemini.
I'm gonna actually ask a question because I think something that immediately, as the skeptic in the room, who's like, AI is, I think, and Cody, because you mentioned Grok, and now we're sort of talking about this potential utilization of collecting and sort of like summarizing or otherwise compiling research or data. I know Grok has kind of come under fire or at least been held to some scrutiny, especially recently, in terms of it being actively iterated on in terms of what kinds of information it's quote unquote supposed to be providing, or what stances or whatever it's supposed to be taking, and that always makes me feel like we have a potential in this particular field where it's really easy for AIs to change behind the scenes without necessarily the changes being super apparent to us on the user side. So as these tools get implemented more and more in various fields, is there a concern of like, okay, well, is open evidence now providing research specifically from these sorts of think tanks, or Are we concerned that the treatment planning that is being suggested by something like Claude might be influenced by lobbying dollars from certain pharmaceutical companies, or issues like that may be, I don't want to say insidious, but intentionally sort of like placed to drive the economic side of treatment, as opposed to the sort of era of AI we're in right now, where it's kind of like the Wild West of figuring out what works and what doesn't and how to get the best use out of it?
I want to take this one initially because I've thought about this a lot, Alan. And part of why I wanted to do this webinar on treatment planning and thinking about using these open source tools is just because it starts to give you this good sense of AI. But the next step for us as health professionals is we're going to have our own AI tools built into our EMRs. We are going to have custom built LLMs for us. Like they're building them right now. And right now, some of the scribes have them, some smaller EMRs do, but like Cerner is going to come out with like its own AI LLM. And those, as clinicians, we need to see what's happening on like ChatGPT and these other ones, but we need to ask our medical purpose use ones need to be built differently. They cannot be black box. They need to be what we call explainable AI. That's why I think open evidence is like a good place to start dabbling, because you can see what explainable AI looks like, where you can go and trace the AI's logic. We can't have the black box of like, where is it pulling this from? Is it being influenced?
Is it accurate?
So is it accurate? Yeah. So to me, and just to like clarify the point of this webinar, I'm like, I think people need to start using these tools to wrap their minds around them. But what we're seeing is just phase one, and we need to start advocating for phase two, which is coming into our EMRs, and we need to advocate for how those are built, and they need to be built differently than the ChatGPTs of the world. I don't know. What do you think of that, Cody?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question for sure, and definitely one that needs to be asked. I was listening to a recent podcast from the APTA where they were talking about ethical concerns or questions, related to this specifically. And like you talked about, Sarah, they mentioned it kind of being a black box or needing to have like model cards, which I didn't know what that meant, but essentially it was like the data on which that it's trained. So you know exactly where the information is coming from. And I think they even made the point too of like, with what the data is trained on or the specific sources, it could have a risk of like bias towards certain populations just for certain treatments, or like you said, Alan. So I think it's definitely one that needs to be asked. And yeah, I agree with you, Sarah, that it's going to be in the EMR and they're going to be specific, I think, to kind of our use case. But yeah, definitely just kind of getting an understanding of what's out there. And I think anytime you're dealing with like a public LLM, it's always knowing like you need to verify whatever it's giving you. So, take it for what it is, but then ultimately you verify it as the clinician. And if you're using it, just remember it's your license. So you've got to verify what's there.
I just want to say to OTs too, like we're like collectively as healthcare workers, like we're a powerful block, and we should imagine how we want to use these tools and be advocating for that, and not just like blindly accept whatever is given to us, because the tech people looking for money are going to have terrible ideas. So we need to be thinking, like imagining what we want and advocating for that, and rejecting the things that are not helpful, because those will come on the market too, and we need to reject those.
Yeah, I mean, to equate this to a field that I have some familiarity with, I know in the IT space, they're using a lot of these sort of LLMs and generating prompts to get them to write code or like do programming tasks. And to that same degree, right? It's like, yeah, you can ask it to do something, but you have to make sure it's doing what you asked it to do. Otherwise, you could be implementing something that may or may not work or have negative consequences, and then That's you making that decision to implement it or incorporate it. It's not the fault of the tool, right? Even if it's totally wrong. And I think part of that, I want to pivot to talking about prompt writing and like structuring prompts properly, because at the end of the day, I think that's with where we're at right now with AI, and I know we're talking about things that may come through on the horizon that'll be more specifically oriented towards healthcare. But with the tools we have right now, it seems like the prime line of defense for making sure we're getting good, useful, reasonable, specific stuff from the AIs that we are using is constructing our prompts as cleanly and as airtightly as possible. So I'm curious, Cody, if you have any thoughts about like, or if you've developed through your use of AI, any like processes that you've found work really well for structuring your prompts to get the most out of these tools with the least risk.
Yeah, for sure. And I haven't developed the specific process I'm going to talk about. I think Google Gemini and ChatGPT both release like prompting or prompt engineering ebooks. So those are really useful to kind of dive deeper on and learn more on. But yeah, anytime it comes to, to prompting, I think of you creating it yourself. So you're actually typing the prompt in, or you're meta prompting. So you're asking the LLM to essentially create one for you. And typically the LLM is better at it than I am. But in general, I like to think of, the quality of your answer comes from the quality of your prompt. So you want to kind of give it a 5-layer framework is how I like to think about it. So you give it a role. So you're going to kind of set the tone and the knowledge scope. You give it context, so background that the model needs on whatever you're talking about. A lot of times, the more context you can give it, the better answer you're going to get. You want to give it a task then at that point. So what do you actually want from it? Apply constraints. So that's kind of your quality control. So if you're thinking about research, you would, want to be specific on what evidence you want, or, what you don't want is also a good way to put it. And then you want to give it a format. So that way it gives it to you exactly the way you want it, whether that's like a bullet list, a executive summary, a short paragraph, or whatever. So I found that if you are applying kind of that 5-layer framework, you're going to get a lot better answers from it whenever you start to use it.
And on a typical, let's say your structure, creating your prompt, or you know what outcome you're looking for, or what information you're hoping to get back from the prompt that you submit. On average, would you say that you are able to get everything you need off of this sort of initial, like, here's the role, context, task, constraints format, send? How often do you feel like, all right, this was a one and return and done interaction, and I've gotten everything I need, and now I can move on to whatever the next phase of what I'm doing is, versus like, okay, this is now a back and forth sort of iterative discussion or adjustment with these programs?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing exactly. Sometimes you can kind of one-shot the prompt and just get exactly what you need. I don't have an exact percentage. I would say I probably more often than not kind of end up on an iterative conversation. And honestly, I just end up talking to it a lot. I'll probably spend more time in it than I should and have longer conversations than I should. But I feel like I end up kind of going back and forth and teasing out different things. Sometimes at the end of what it gives you as an output, it'll ask you kind of like, do you want me to go further on this? Or was there a specific topic you want me to expound upon? And I find that I end up kind of just going down a rabbit hole sometimes, but you can one-shot a prompt every now and then and get it.
I bet that feels pretty good. Like, gotcha.
It does.
Yeah,
it does.
Bang. Especially because, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these options or the things we're trying to utilize these AIs to do, we're not asking them to do our jobs for us, right? We're basically saying like, hey, can you ex- make more expedient aspects of my job or aspects of this certain situation in order to make me more able to do other aspects of the job that are otherwise held back by this, right? Like in Sarah's case, like she was talking about using open evidence, and it sounds like the idea is, yeah, I could go and do like look up all these things and do them all myself, but it's going to take hours and hours and hours of work that can be done in, seconds to minutes by this program that then free up those hours to look at that data and make use of it, or otherwise make productive use of time. So is that sort of the, I don't want to say end goal, but is that sort of the ideal for incorporating AI into OT, in your opinion? Is this idea of like we're speeding up parts of the process in order to be able to devote time elsewhere? Or is there something else, some other niche where we're hoping that these programs eventually land in?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, of speeding up, kind of accelerating your learning, especially when you're looking at evidence and researching different things. That is tremendously helpful from that standpoint. And I think Sarah mentioned it earlier about, there's so much information out there. There's so much information, kind of thinking about even your EMR and what I would hope it gets to in the future too, on like the patient you're seeing and their past medical history, the previous visits they've been on, and different things like that. I think about it more of kind of like augmenting my intelligence. So I can't know everything. I know hopefully a good bit, I would like to think. But yeah, I think it's a lot smarter than I am, and helps me kind of collect more information that I can then use and put into place for the person that's in front of me. So I think the ultimate goal would be able to eventually, once it's in the EMRs and more of a clinical decision support tool, to use it as an augmented intelligence where it can kind of synthesize what's going on with the person in front of us, allow us to make even better decisions. And then we're able to be even more human with them and more present and more connected than necessarily, on our computers or in the EMR itself, or worried about a note or something along those lines. Maybe that answers the question.
I think it does. And I'm actually curious in to kind of piggyback off of that. And we're going to talk a little more in detail about limitations and like ethical considerations in the incorporation of AI tools. But is there a fear in that sense as we're developing these more medically specific tools and diagnostic tools and all these other sort of options that are being developed right now in the AI space? Is there a fear similar to those expressed in other industries? I know during the writer's strike a couple of years ago, there was a lot of talk about like, we don't want AI basically replacing the writer's room and writing scripts. I know in IT field, there's a sort of sense of like, well, eventually we're not going to need people who know how to program anymore because we can just prompt an AI to write a program for us. Is there a fear in the medical field, and how justified do you think it is that we could eventually see like just a purely AI doctor that you plug symptoms into, and it has whatever maybe additional photographic tools that it needs to make diagnoses and apply treatments and set prescriptions, and anything that would essentially push the human element out of care? I'd love to hear Sarah's take on this, because I know that especially when we're talking about value-based, we've been talking about value-based care a lot, and I think that we've talked over and over again about how bringing that human element forward on the patient side is important. And as we look at the incorporating these tools more and more, I'm just curious if there's a fear, and perhaps even a justified fear, that like we could see the human element from the practitioner side sort of like fade away.
Mm-hmm. I think that goes to or back to the point of like, we need to be imagining now how we want AI to be used, because absolutely people are going to have terrible ideas and try to implement them. I think especially what we're seeing early stage is for like more talk therapy, where the idea of like you could just be chatting with an AI companion versus talking to a therapist. And some of the ways I've heard that addressed is, or especially at like lower tier things. This is getting very complex and maybe beyond the scope here, but
I know. I'm sorry that I was like, we're going to talk about treatment planning, and then I was like, are you scared of being replaced by a robot? But I think it's it's one of those questions that in so many other fields where we're incorporating it more and more, it
yes,
keeps coming up.
Yes, I think for us as therapists, I just keep thinking, if someone just had a stroke, are we going to give them a screen? Like, humans are, there is something inherently human or healing about being around other humans. And I think as therapists, we need to really be thinking about the humanness that we bring as one of the most important things, and really focusing on that skill, and using AI so we can come into the room fully present. Because is AI better than a clinician that's staring at the screen the whole time? Yeah, like probably, but we need to be bringing our humanness into our sessions, and that's something we should be doing anyway. And I think AI is going to push us towards, and I think it's going to help us. Yeah, I think it's going to help us be more present. Something I just keep thinking about with treatment planning is these AI tools are going to make it so we don't have to start with a blank page when we have a new patient coming. The demand that is on us currently, where we cognitively shift from patient to patient with all these different diagnoses, it's honestly, it's too hard. And what we end up doing is we fall into ruts of kind of doing, we tend to do what we're comfortable with. And I just think of, I shared the prompt that I used for a patient with POTS, and I was like, if I plug that in before I walked into the room, it would just like high level remind me of the 6 things I should be thinking about. And I know those things, but it's nice that they're externalized and I'm not having to pull them up on the fly as I'm walking out of a room with a patient with MS. So I think they're going to be a huge help. And to Cody's point, as long as we utilize them correctly.
Are there other, I mean, so we sort of touched on in that case the sort of natural limitations of non-human like entities in care. Are there other ethical considerations in terms of using AI to do patient care or to do treatment planning, or even, I guess, more broadly, ethical considerations to using AI at all, right? I think I saw recently OpenAI basically released a statement saying, like, please stop saying thank you to the AI, because every time you say thank you, it has to respond to you. And that exchange, thank you and you're welcome or whatever, takes like a gallon of water to produce that response. And, there's energy concerns there as well. Are there other ethical considerations that we should be thinking about as we incorporate these tools more and more into our daily and professional lives?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all the tools we've talked about so far are all public LLMs. We haven't, not any that are directly in our EMRs. So really important for those. Obviously, they're not HIPAA compliant, so you would never put any PHI information in them. So that would be one really important ethical concern, is to make sure your patient status stays private. And then another thing is hallucinations and kind of the accuracy from LLM. So sometimes the term hallucination is basically, it's going to state a fact really confidently, but it actually just made that fact up, or it just made the citation up. And so that's where you want to really double check those things. So if it is giving you a resource, which it sounds like Open Evidence does a lot better job at that than say like a Chat GPT or Claude or one of those things. So always checking kind of the stats it gives you or the citations it's given you. And then on that recent podcast I mentioned, one concern they thought about was, do we become over reliant on AI? So is there a potential like de-skilling of we're no longer using our clinical reasoning and we're just relying on the AI itself to tell us exactly what to do, when it's more of, that clinical thinking partner or brainstorming or just kind of collecting different ideas, but not outright making the decision for you. And I think you could run into issues there for sure. And then another interesting kind of ethical dilemma or concern, I guess more in a positive light, would be once AI becomes so good, say in several years, that is it actually unethical to not use it? So if it has all the intelligence and essentially it is augmenting our intelligence, is it unethical to not use it? Because if you're not using it, are you able to still give the best care possible to the person in front of you? I thought that was a really interesting thought that I hadn't really had before. But yeah, those are a few for sure.
That is actually really interesting. I've never heard that take before. It immediately made me think of the issues we are facing now around like vaccinations and people refusing to get them or use them, or the anyway. That's a totally different subject. I don't want to. We're already pressed for time, and we have questions coming in that I want to get to in our Q&A. So I'll not go down that separate rabbit hole there. Really quickly, I know we've already talked about developments that are incoming specifically for in medicine in terms of specific LLMs that are heading our way and diagnostic tools that may be on the horizon. What would you both like to see from AI in terms of treatment planning in the future, or let's say like the next 5 years? I'll start with Sarah on this one.
I'll take that for sure. Something that I'm excited about is just to see some options that are occupational therapy specific, that are really catered around pull evidence from our journals. There'll have to be some kind of content agreement there, and then pull from our master clinicians some of their best practices. If you're a member of the club, you know that I'm working on clinical decision support, and I can just see, or my hope is to be a part of that. And my goal for us is to have just reminders of best practices on the screen in front of you every time you're seeing a patient. So you're not starting from a blank page. And as new evidence is coming out, that you're just being reminded if there's a new standard of care out there. I'm really excited for us for what that will enable for us, just to have that information at our fingertips. It kind of makes me think, how have we been doing this before? Because the best research has been hard to find. It's not, your EMR screen is so crowded and convoluted currently. I'm just excited for that new interface in the future that's going to be driven towards providing the best care. And hopefully we have financial incentives to be doing so. I know we've talked about value-based care on the podcasts a lot. So multiple things are changing all at once. And despite all the concerns, I am excited about this future.
Yeah, I think for me, I think about kind of all the information and encounters a patient has had up until the point that I get to see them. And thankfully, within the system that I'm in, I can see a lot of the notes previously that the patient has had in those encounters, and I can read and I can go back through them, but that takes a lot of time. And so it'd be awesome to have essentially like a AI built into the EMR that can pull all that information for me, synthesize it all together. I can get a summary and know exactly what's going on without having to read every single note. I think that would allow me to make better decisions in that moment, have more time. Obviously, the documentation aspect of decreasing that burden. I don't think any of us got into the field to document. We got into the field to care for patients and care for people. So I think that allows us to do that more And then even thinking more along the lines of, I'm in outpatient setting. So if I had the ability to have a AI kind of give me a summary of the patients I would be able to see that day as I'm driving into work, to almost get prepared of like, oh, I know I have Joe this morning and this is what we did last time, and just kind of get prepared and have a summary of those things, I think would be really cool. And yeah, love to see something like that in the future.
That's a great example of I've seen that on one of the demos that I did where it reads you an update on the patient that you're about to see. I saw it catered for home health therapists. So it feels like some of these things that we're talking about are hypothetical because we're not seeing them yet in our clinic, but guarantee, I not guarantee, but someone is probably working on them and they're going to come faster than we realize.
And that's the Sarah Lyon guarantee, everyone.
That is not my guarantee.
That is a guarantee, 100%. It's happening. I do want to set aside some time here for questions I've seen coming in from our live chat. We always love seeing our live watchers on the webinar here interacting with us and putting in their thoughts and questions and personal experiences with whatever topics we're talking about. We've had some interesting questions come through that I would love to get through because partially we have always run out of time in the past before we get to this part. So our first question comes from Brooke Andrus, and the question is directed to Sarah, but I'm going to open it up to both of you. It says, Sarah, do you ever worry about OTs or other practitioners becoming too dependent on AI to the point that it limits their creative thinking or problem solving? And I saw this sentiment echoed as well by Kathleen Sebasic. Forgive me for however I'm pronouncing your name.
I think as OTs, we're well equipped to start thinking about this problem and planning for it. Cody kind of mentioned already how AI does almost have an addictive nature to it. Like once you start chatting, you want to keep going, just like on social media, where I think all of us know what that addiction feels like, where you just want to keep scrolling. And as OT, something we need to be thinking about this already for ourselves and for our patients is taking time away from these screens and really protecting that creative time to let our brains just process and be creative. I know that I already struggle with that with our current tech stack available to us, and AI is going to make it more. I don't know, we're going to want to spend more and more time online, so we have to be more and more protective, and that's part of our roles as OTs for ourselves and for our patients is protecting our creativity in our brain space. Yeah, and we'll just have to keep getting better at that, and something that we're going to have to be thinking about helping our patients with.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say, I think it could be easy to become dependent on it where you're not having to think as much. There's a cognitive load with every patient or every case, but I think it's, you have to kind of have the discipline to continue to sharpen your clinical reasoning. And that's more of a individual, I think, responsibility. It could definitely be easy to become dependent on it for sure, though.
Great. Got a question here from Lynn Brown about some of the abbreviations we've been using. I guess I can take this one. I think probably the most common one we've been using here that might be new to a lot of us looking at AI for the first time is LLM, which stands for Large Language Model. It's basically a category of AIs that are trained and iterated over time on various like texts and human interactions in order to be able to answer and understand your text prompts. So there's AIs of all different kinds that are capable of analyzing and doing all sorts of stuff within other systems. But when we talk about LLMs in this episode, we're specifically referring to these types of AIs that are able to take on a prompt, like, or even, as Cody mentioned earlier, taking on a role, right? Hey, for this prompt, I want you to act as a PT instructor, right? In order for a model to understand that, it has to be trained on a huge amount of language and adapting to language models. So that's what that means. I never get to answer these, so that felt pretty good. Our next question comes from Sarah Railson, who wanted to follow up on some of the ethical side of AI use. She says, I've been wondering about the ethical side, especially with environmental costs. Would love to hear your thoughts. Cody, what are your thoughts on the environmental impact of AI? We know that it uses a huge amount of electrical energy and produces a lot of heat. Also, recently discovering how much water it takes to keep a lot of these servers up and running. What are your thoughts on the cost-benefit analysis of the environmental side?
That's a big question. Honestly, I have not thought about that a lot. I probably should think about it more. But yeah, that's not an area where I've really have any knowledge to be able to speak on it, I think, in any way that would produce a good conversation. I just don't know enough about it, honestly.
Totally fair.
Sarah, I've thought about it just because so many people or so many OTs also have that concern. I feel like OTs tend to have a bent towards being really concerned for the environment. And I do think that is something we have to weigh, and we have to be weighing how our energy is created, and another time for us to imagine the future we want and be vocal about what that looks like, because there's different ways to get energy that are, some are better than others, and we need to be a vocal, we're a big group, we need to be a vocal cohort about that. I do think that there's exciting innovations on the horizon there.
Yeah, I think I'll also add that I think because AI is new, a lot of these things are, or I should say relatively new, a lot of these things are being held up to scrutiny in a way that a lot of our existing tools are not. So, we talk about, Cody mentioned earlier, like now, instead of Googling something and trawling through stuff, we can plug something like a prompt into an AI and get more succinct or better answers. And we have not thought much in the past, I think, about like every time you do a Google search, it takes that energy is coming from somewhere. That's a server that's running. It's a prompt that's responding. It's and I think because this tool is new, that aspect of it is being held up to a much stricter rubric than stuff we've already been doing in the past in a lot of regards. Jill Mott has a question. We'll take this as our final question from our Q&A. Jill Mott asks, and I'm going to direct this one at Cody because we had him sort of take the lead on prompt structuring earlier. Cody, could you give an example request for AI using the 5 framework points you mentioned earlier in this discussion?
Yeah, so going through that, I have one. It's more of a PT related example. So I apologize if it's not directly applicable from that standpoint, but thinking about a role, it's like act as a PT instructor. Context, you're preparing a talk on ACL rehab for PT students. Task, write 5 quiz questions on ACL progression principles. Constraints, keep questions open-ended and clinically applicable, and then format output as a numbered list. And so I'll read it real quick just as a prompt itself. So act as a PT instructor, preparing a talk on ACL rehab for PT students, write 5 quiz questions on ACL progression principles, keep questions open-ended and clinically applicable, and output as a numbered list.
Boom. Not much else to say than that. As we're kind of coming to the end of our discussion here, I'm curious, Cody, if you have any thoughts on what the most important takeaway from this conversation, more specifically, I guess, as it relates to AI and its potential use in treatment planning. If there was sort of one major takeaway that you wanted me to walk away from this conversation with, what would it be?
Yeah, so I don't think AI is going anywhere. I think it's going to become, even more ingrained in all that we do, in our EMR and our daily life. I think that's probably just a fact that's going to happen. I think for us, it's just being, curious about it, continue to learn about it, being willing to implement or play around with the technology, like Sarah said, so you can have a voice about it. But ultimately, I think what's going to separate us, in patient care as AI becomes even more involved is just our humanness, like Sarah said, being more human with that person in front of you, empathizing, connecting, communicating and being present is ultimately going to stand out more, I think, as we shift into an AI world.
I hate to say that I agreed emphatically with everything you just said. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been our OT potential discussion on AI and treatment planning. Cody Lee, thank you so much for all of your insights and knowledge. And you're sort of like on the cutting edge of the incorporation of this technology and these tools. So thank you for sharing your insights with us here. And Sarah, as always, thank you for being here as well. This is just a reminder to all of you out there that there will be a post-course quiz on this discussion in order to get your CEU credit. So make sure you look out for that link and get those answers in order to get your credit for this course. And with that said, thank you all for joining us for this webinar, and we will see you on the next one. We're going to do our AI prompted goodbye. Imagine you are two guests on an OT podcast talking about AIs, and you've reached the end of the webinar and have to say farewell to all of the guests in the chat.
Goodbye.
Go.
Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for joining us on the OT Potential Podcast. To earn 1 hour of AOTA approved continuing education for your time today, you will need to sign in or sign up at otpotential.com. Once you're in the OT Potential Club, you will find a 5-question post-course quiz connected to this episode. When you pass the quiz with a score of 75% or higher, you will be able to download a PDF certificate that certifies your completion of this course. Okay, I want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.